Agriculture fields are regularly watered. The farmers supply them with nutrients. The crops in them are well maintained and generally highly nutritious. It is no wonder that besides the crops that were planted by the farmers, all kinds of plants and other species opportunistically grow and invade farmed fields, depleting the crops of their resources or even feeding on the crops themselves. Farmers relentlessly fight against these invasions that threaten the yield of the crops. Weeds are plucked, pests and diseases are treated with all kinds of phytosanitary products, all of which demands costs in time and money. Numerous breeding programs aim at improving plant traits that will make the plant cultivation more cost-effective by reducing the amount of time and the complexity of the tasks a farmer needs to devote to protect their crops. In fact, over 90% of the genetically engineered crops are either insecticide, pesticide, or herbicide resistant. These crops are marketed as being very cost-effective for farming, as they do not require any elaborate manual treatments to get rid of pests and diseases. Unsurprisingly, this has led to a dramatic increase in the use of pesticides over time. Unfortunately, intensive use of pesticides, insecticides, and herbicides can have dramatic consequences for the human health, the environment, but also the health of the crops. Let's take the example of the Roundup Ready crops produced by Monsanto. These crops have been engineered to be resistant to a broad-spectrum herbicide called glyphosate and distributed by Monsanto under the name of Roundup Ready. When a field that contains Roundup Ready crops is invaded by weeds, it can be sprayed by the Roundup herbicide. The active component of Roundup, glyphosate, is preventing the weeds from producing some essential proteins, but it does not affect the protein production of the Roundup Ready crops. So after treatment, Roundup Ready crops will be left intact, whereas all weeds in the field will die out. This technology is appealing because it does not require manual weeding of the field. However, very quickly after its introduction, it resulted in the emergence of herbicide-resistant weeds. Indeed, when Roundup and Roundup Ready crops were first cultivated by farmers, the herbicide was very efficient in eradicating almost all weeds in the field. However, weeds usually have a seed bank in the soil from which new plants can grow. This seed bank contains thousands of seeds, and at least some of them might be naturally resistant to Roundup. If such seeds germinate and grow into an adult plant, the Roundup spraying will not affect it. This resistant weed can produce even more seeds to grow even more Roundup-resistant weeds the following year. This cycle continues until the field is again invaded by weeds, except that this time the weeds cannot be eradicated by Roundup application. In fact, there is a clear trend showing that the first few years after a herbicide is introduced in the field, it successfully destroys all the weeds. However, after a few years, resistant weeds emerge and continue to spread in the field despite the increased use of Roundup, up to the stage where spraying with the herbicide is just a very expensive but useless treatment of the crops. In a similar way, overuse of insecticides and other pesticides can produce resistant diseases of pathogens of plants. Pesticides can also have dire consequences for human health and well-being, whether directly or indirectly. Among the direct consequences, farmers that regularly apply pesticides in their fields, or even families that live nearby heavily sprayed crops, can suffer an array of symptoms and diseases, from mild skin and respiratory irritations to deadly intoxications and congenital diseases that can lead to death. But even more worrying are the indirect effects of the pesticides of human health, social and economical well-being, through the disturbance of ecosystem balance and the destruction of biodiversity. Broad-spectrum insecticides affect not only insects that are grazing plants, but also insects that provide plant services such as pollinators. The number of studies showing the negative effects of insecticides of honeybees and wild pollinators is constantly increasing. Bees exposed to insecticides can have an altered behavior, not being able to correctly forage and return to their hives, or outright increased mortality rates. In fact, ever since the 1960s, a global trend in pollinator decline is observed, with dramatic pollinator losses for some ecosystems and regions. Insect-pollinated crops are directly affected by this pollinator loss, with some agricultures having to rent beehives to fertilize their fields, as is often done for canola crops, and others resolving to pollinate crops by hand, as is the case with apple farmers in China, for instance. But the ramifications of pollinator losses go beyond reduced yields in crops. Without efficient pollination, not only crops, but many non-cultivated species also fail to reproduce, and with them all the associated above and underground insect and microorganism flora, followed by larger animals that feed on this flora. The obvious solution to this issue is to reduce the use of herbicides, insecticides, and pesticides. But how do we then produce enough food in the fields facing all kinds of diseases? One way to do this would be to use genetically engineered crops that produce their own toxins. Such crops already exist even among the non-engineered ones. Potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco produce aromatic compounds such as solanine, tomatidine, or nicotine, which are natural insect repellents. Nowadays, genetically engineered crops that produce bacterial insecticide toxins are also commercially available, such as the Bt cotton. These crops produce very small amounts of insecticides and only when being under herbivory attacks, which dramatically reduces the amount of toxins remaining in the environment. However, they can still result in the advertent selection for pesticide-resistant disease. Another long-term possibility would be to increase agrobiodiversity in cultivated ecosystems so that they become more resilient and up to face a wide change of environmental variation. More about this in the agrobiodiversity video.